Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk with me, Joe, and of course the amazing Sunny. Sunny, what's been making you laugh lately? You always have the best stories.
Hey, Joe, and hello to everyone listening. You know I love watching people and just seeing what they're up to.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Well, just the other day, I was at the supermarket.
Right.
And I'm in the produce aisle, and this guy is seriously, like, full-on having a conversation with a bell pepper.
No way.
Like, he's really debating with this pepper about whether it's ripe enough. He's poking it, tilting his head. I swear, it looked like he was getting feedback from the pepper. I almost lost it. So what about you, Joe? Anything crazy happening in your world?
That is amazing. Yeah, you're always finding those gems, you know. My latest laugh was courtesy of my dog, Sparky.
Oh, Sparky.
We were at the park, and he was completely convinced that a squirrel had buried the most incredible treasure ever under this one tree. I'm talking full-on digging frenzy, tail wagging like crazy. 10 minutes later, he unearths this super muddy rock. The look on his face was pure betrayal. It was priceless.
Yeah.
Anyway, you know, Sunny and I, we're both Americans living here in Taiwan.
Yeah.
And we get to hear from a lot of different perspectives. Something that's come up a lot lately, especially from our Taiwanese listeners, is this whole situation with Chinese spouses.
Right.
So we thought we'd take a deep dive into what some people are calling Chinese spouses' tears.
Yeah, it's a topic with a lot of different angles, and we've had so many people asking us to really dig into it. So in this deep dive, we're going to break down a few key things.
Yeah, it just sounds good.
First, we want to look at how some Chinese spouses react after being deported and what might be going through their minds, you know, what might be behind those reactions. Then we'll explore this idea that you hear sometimes about Chinese people being, and this is a generalization, obviously, arrogant when they feel safe, and then becoming really submissive when they're dealing with someone powerful. We'll try to see if we can trace where that perception might come from. And finally, we want to take a step back and consider some of the bigger, maybe less obvious issues that this all brings up.
Yeah, I think that's super important.
We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started.
So the case that really kicked off this whole discussion is about this woman, Miss Liu, who you might know online as Kokia. She was pretty active on social media, especially her account, and she was very open about supporting China forcefully unifying with Taiwan.
Right.
Some of her statements were quite direct. Like, she said things like, mainland China's forceful unification of Taiwan needs no other reason. She even talked about being impatient because unification was taking so long. You can imagine that those kinds of statements made some waves here in Taiwan.
Yeah, definitely. And because of that, the National Immigration Agency here in Taiwan decided to revoke her residency permit.
Right.
They cited regulations related to national security and social stability. You know, these are things that governments put in place for a reason.
Yeah, for sure.
And now she's barred from reapplying for 5 years. It's a pretty serious consequence for expressing those views publicly while living here.
Absolutely. And this is where things get really interesting and maybe a little bit confusing. After they revoked her residency, Mrs. Liu actually expressed remorse and said that she wanted to stay in Taiwan.
Oh, wow.
This is the part that we really need to unpack.
Yeah.
You have someone who was very publicly advocating for unification.
Yep.
And then, when that leads to her being asked to leave, she suddenly wants to stay. What could be going on there? What do you think, Sunny?
Well, if we try to look at it from her point of view, you know, maybe there's a conflict going on between what she believes politically and what she wants in her personal life. It's possible that she really believes in unification with mainland China.
Right.
But at the same time, she's built a life here in Taiwan that she doesn't want to give up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Maybe she likes the freedom here or the quality of life. Our sources suggest that she did enjoy living in Taiwan. Being forced to leave all that behind, even if it's because of her own beliefs, would be a pretty tough thing to deal with. And it brings up this bigger issue, doesn't it? Like, how hard is it for Chinese spouses in Taiwan to really feel like they belong here, especially when their views clash with what most people here think?
Definitely. And the reaction from Taiwanese people online to her statements really shows that there's a divide.
Yeah, for sure.
And she even tried to get her residency back.
Oh, wow.
That shows a real shift in what she was saying publicly. Like she was trying to backtrack on her previous statements. But in the end, it wasn't enough to change the decision. It makes you wonder, was she really changing her mind? Or was it more about wanting to stay in a place where she had a comfortable life?
Right. That's tough to say for sure.
Yeah, it's hard to know for sure what's going on inside someone's head, you know?
Exactly. And it's also important to look at this from different perspectives. Our sources mention that some media outlets in Hong Kong actually questioned whether Taiwan was being hypocritical when it came to freedom of speech. They basically said, if Taiwan really believes in freedom of expression, shouldn't that include letting foreign residents speak their minds, even if their views are controversial? It's a difficult balance to strike.
It is. You want to protect your own country, of course. But at the same time, you don't want to be seen as silencing people just because you don't like what they're saying.
Yeah, exactly. It's a tough one, especially when you're dealing with people coming from a place with a completely different political system. Okay, so that brings us to this second big idea we wanted to explore. It's about this common criticism, you hear it a lot, this idea that some Chinese people are kind of two-faced, like they're all arrogant when they feel safe, but then they become super submissive when they're dealing with someone powerful.
Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it. It's a pretty harsh generalization, but it's out there. So where does that perception even come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's a sensitive one, too. I mean, it's important to remember that we're talking about a general perception here, not about every single Chinese person.
Right, absolutely. It's definitely not fair to stereotype an entire group of people.
Well, for sure not.
But this idea has been around for a while, and there are some historical and social factors that people point to try and understand it. Let's take a look at some of those possible explanations.
Maybe lay it on me.
Well, one thing that comes up a lot is the influence of legalist philosophy, which has been pretty significant in Chinese history. This philosophy puts a lot of emphasis on power, on this idea that might makes right. And that can lead to a culture where respecting those in positions of power becomes really important, maybe even more important than treating those who are seen as weaker with respect.
Yeah, I can see how that would create a kind of imbalance in how people treat each other.
Right. And then you have the imperial examination system and this whole Guanbenwei culture, which is all about putting government officials at the center of everything. Historically, this system really pushed people to be obedient to their superiors, to kind of bow down to those higher up in the government.
Oh.
There's even the saying, which means you should literally lower yourself 3 notches when you see an official. And this kind of top-down structure, unfortunately, can make it easier for those in power to mistreat those below them. It's kind of like that saying, "Whatki."
Wait, what does that mean?
It means a big shop might bully its customers, but a powerful customer can also bully a shop.
Oh.
It's about taking advantage of whatever power you have.
That makes sense.
And then on top of all that, you have the traditional small-scale farming economy that was so common in China for centuries. Life was hard and competition for resources was fierce.
Right. Yeah.
In that kind of environment, siding with those who had power, who could offer protection, might have been seen as just a smart way to survive.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a factor.
And maybe, in some cases, it also meant taking advantage of those who were even weaker than you to make sure you and your family had what you needed.
It's kind of a dog-eat-dog situation.
It's not pretty, but it might have been a reality for some people.
So it's not necessarily that people are just born this way, but that these bigger historical and social structures could shape how they behave in different situations.
Exactly. And our sources actually give some really clear historical examples of this playing out. Take the Qing dynasty's interactions with other countries. With Russia, for example, they signed the Treaty of Nerchinsk, and it seemed like they yielded pretty easily. Then you have the Opium War with Great Britain. There was some resistance at first, but when faced with a stronger military, they quickly agreed to terms that weren't great for them.
Right.
And maybe the most obvious example is the First Sino-Japanese War. The Qing dynasty seemed to underestimate Japan. Maybe they thought they were weaker or less important, but when they lost fast, and then they had to sign this really unequal treaty.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds like a pattern. A little bit of pushback at the start, maybe even some overconfidence, and then bam, quick surrender when things get real.
Exactly. And these dynamics weren't just in foreign relations. You see similar patterns in more recent history, too. In the early days of communist China, they cracked down hard on landlords and capitalists within the country. But at the same time, they were pretty deferential towards the Soviet Union, maybe even having to pay them reparations. Then there was the Cultural Revolution, all that internal chaos and persecution, and then a pretty big shift in attitude towards the U.S. when Nixon visited.
It's almost like they flip a switch, depending on who they see as holding the most power in a given situation.
Yeah,
What about today? Do we still see examples of this in China?
Our sources suggest that, yeah, we do. If you look at the relationship between the government and the people, there's often a noticeable level of, I guess you could say, obedience to authority. And sometimes you see this indifference towards people who are marginalized or vulnerable, like street vendors or migrant workers. They're the ones who often get the short end of the stick when it comes to dealing with authority figures.
Yeah, that's definitely something you hear about. What about China's role on the global stage?
Well, that's where you see what some people call selective aggression.
Okay.
They might be very assertive, even confrontational towards Taiwan or smaller countries in the South China Sea. But when it comes to the US or Europe, major powers, they tend to be more cautious, probably because they know how much they depend on them economically.
Right. It makes sense.
It's all about being strategic, based on a realistic understanding of who holds the cards, you know?
So it's not necessarily that they're always arrogant or always submissive, but that their behavior changes depending on who they're interacting with and what the power dynamics are.
Right. And there are some psychological and sociological explanations for this as well.
Yep.
Some of our sources mention the influence of social Darwinism, that whole survival of the fittest idea applied to society.
Yeah.
So you might try to get on the good side of those in power just to survive and get ahead. And then there's the psychology of obedience to authority. In a society with a long history of authoritarian rule, that kind of obedience can become really ingrained.
Interesting. So we're talking about a mix of historical factors, social structures, and even some deep-seated psychological stuff. But the sources we looked at also hinted that maybe this behavior isn't set in stone, like it could change over time. How do they think that might happen?
Well, they suggested a few things. First, strengthening the laws and institutions that protect individual rights is crucial.
Right. So there are checks and balances on power.
Exactly. And then there's education. Promoting values like equality and respect for everyone, regardless of their social status. That's really key.
Yeah, changing hearts and minds.
Exactly. And finally, looking at examples from other countries that are strong not just in terms of their military or economy, but also ethically and morally, that could help shift those long-standing patterns of behavior.
Right, seeing that true strength can come from doing the right thing.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about how one person's actions can have really big consequences, and about this idea of arrogance versus submissiveness, and where that might come from. But there's one more area we wanted to explore, right? Like, what are some of the broader implications of this whole Miss Liu situation?
Yeah, what might seem like just one incident, it can actually open up a whole can of worms, you know what I mean? One of the big things it highlights is this tension between freedom of speech and national security here in Taiwan, especially when it comes to talking about unification with mainland China. As we mentioned before, Taiwan sees advocating for unification, especially by force, as a threat to its safety and stability. But from mainland China's perspective, they might see it as Taiwan trying to silence anyone who supports unification.
It's a really sensitive issue.
It is. And then there's a question of how the rest of the world sees Taiwan's immigration policies. They're trying to walk a tightrope between upholding their democratic values and protecting themselves from what they see as real threats.
Right.
On the one hand, other countries might say, okay, Taiwan needs to do what it takes to stay safe, especially with all the tension going on.
Right.
But on the other hand, some might say, hold on, is it really okay to kick someone out just because of their political opinions, even if they are controversial? It sets a precedent, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And the internet plays a huge role in all of this, too. Miss Lulu was using YouTube and TikTok and things like that to spread her message.
Right.
How do you even begin to deal with those kinds of pro-unification narratives online?
That's a massive challenge, you know? Just deporting one person isn't going to stop the flow of information and influence across the Taiwan Strait online.
Right.
Our sources mention how people reported Mrs. Liu's online activities, and there are more and more cases like that popping up. It shows how people are becoming more and more vigilant online and how the internet is becoming this battleground for different ideas. It's almost like a new kind of information warfare.
Wow, yeah. And it really underscores how differently people in Taiwan and mainland China view this whole issue of unification. You've got the majority of people in Taiwan who are against it, and then you have mainland China where it's the official policy, and at least some people support it, even if it means using force. The polls in Taiwan show like only 11.8% of people support unification. That's a huge gap.
It is. And it's very likely that the differences in how people live in Taiwan and mainland China, things like freedom and quality of life, that probably plays a big role in shaping those different views. If you're used to living in a democracy with a lot of freedom, it's understandable to be hesitant about embracing a system that's more restrictive.
Right. And we can't forget about those Taiwanese artists who were repeating that China-Taiwan province line on Weibo. Our sources said the Taiwanese Mainland Affairs Council is actually looking into those cases. It seems like there are a lot of different ways that pressure and influence can be applied.
Definitely. So even though the Mizzaloo case is just one example, it really reflects these bigger challenges that Taiwan faces in dealing with mainland China. It's this constant balancing act between upholding their democratic values, like freedom of speech, and protecting their national security, all while managing this complex relationship in the age of the internet.
It's a lot to juggle.
Yeah.
So to wrap things up, we've looked at how one person's actions can highlight some really sensitive issues.
Yeah.
We've explored this idea of arrogance and submissiveness and where that might come from historically and culturally.
What?
And we've touched on the wider implications of this whole situation, like freedom of speech, the internet, and the really different views on unification.
It's a lot to think about. It really shows how complex this whole issue is. There are no easy answers, and you need to understand the history, the culture, and what's happening in the world today to even begin to grasp it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sunny, as always, thanks for your awesome insights.
Always happy to chat, Joe. It's so important to be open-minded and try to see things from different perspectives, especially with something this complicated.
Right. And for all of you listening, here's something to consider. The world's so connected now, right? We have the internet, social media, everything's so intertwined. So how do you think these different ideas about national security and freedom of speech, how are those going to shape how countries interact with each other in the future? And what does it even mean to be a sovereign nation in this digital age? That's a big question, something to really think about.
A really good question.
So thanks for diving deep with us on this one. We hope it's given you a lot to chew on. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.
Take care, everyone.
See ya.